Hand over the ledger or you'll lie in this ditch the same as her husband did." Neither man holding a gun on Delphine that morning knew a rider on the ridge above them had spent 6 patient years. The pistol never wavered, and behind the man 2 more riders sat their horses across the trail, blocking the only road out. The front wheel of Delphine's wagon cracked clean through where they'd forced her off the grade, dust still hanging in the air like it hadn't decided whether to settle. She understood, in that one frozen breath, that the morning they murdered her husband had never actually ended. It had only been waiting for her to be alone enough to finish. She did not know yet that a rider had been watching this exact stretch of trail for 3 days, waiting for these 3 men in particular, and that by nightfall, none of them would ride out of these hills the way they'd ridden in. Delphine Hale had grown up believing that grief, at least, was private. You buried a man, you wore black for a season, you let the neighbors bring you bread they didn't know how to season, and eventually the world let you alone with your sorrow. Nobody had prepared her for grief that could be hunted, or for a dead man's silence that could still be worth killing for. 10 weeks earlier, in Larkspur Crossing, Wyoming Territory, in the cooling days of that long autumn of 1881, her husband, Elias Hale, had ridden out to survey a boundary line for the county recorder. They found what was left of the wagon at the bottom of Widow's Grade, the same grade that would later take her family's name for, a reason she hadn't understood until that morning, and the coroner had called it a broken axle and a bad turn. Elias was not a careless man. Elias had counted every board in a fence twice before he'd hammer a single nail, and he had ridden that grade 100 times in every kind of weather without so much as a stumbled horse. But grief does not argue with a coroner's report, and so Delphine had buried her husband under a story that didn't fit him, because the alternative, that somebody had wanted him dead, was a thought too large to carry alone in a house that suddenly had one too many empty chairs. She had not known then that Elias kept a second set of books. For 6 years he had worked as the county's assistant land recorder, a quiet post that paid little and asked less, filing claims and deeds and the endless paperwork of a territory being carved up faster than any office could track. It was tedious work. It was also, as it turned out, exactly the kind of work that let a careful man notice a pattern nobody else was positioned to see, claims filed and quietly refiled under new names within weeks of a homesteader's sudden departure, water rights signed away by men who, when Elias tried to find them later to confirm the sale, did not exist at any address in the territory. Small ranches swallowed whole by the Cordell Cattle Syndicate, one after another, always with a signature, always with paperwork that looked clean enough that nobody above the county line ever asked a second question. Elias had started keeping his own record almost by accident, the way a careful man keeps records of anything that troubles him. By the time he understood what he was looking at, he had built, without quite meaning to, the only written proof in the territory that the syndicate's rise had been paved with forged claims, bought silence, and at least 4 deaths that had been filed as accidents. He had told Delphine none of it. She had wondered aloud in the last month of his life why he came home some nights with that particular tightness around his eyes, the look of a man carrying something he didn't know how to set down, and he had waved it off as nothing, only county business, only the tiresome weight of a job nobody thanked him for. She had believed him because she had no reason not to, and because a marriage runs on the assumption that your husband tells you the things that matter. It was only after his death, going through the strong box under the floorboards of their bedroom, looking for the deed to their own small freight claim, that she found the ledger wrapped in oilcloth and understood, cover to cover, exactly what her husband had spent the last year of his life, and exactly why a broken axle on a road he knew better than his own hands had suddenly seemed plausible to men who wanted it to be. She had not gone to the sheriff. Sheriff Dunmore's office sat 2 doors down from the Cordell Syndicate's land agent, and the sheriff himself had been seen at Silas Cordell's table often enough that half the town had stopped pretending the arrangement was a secret. She had not gone to the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne either, because Cheyenne was 4 days' ride, and she had a freight contract to keep, and a ranch payment due, and no proof yet that the ledger would survive the trip, let alone convince anyone with the authority to act on it. So, she had done the only thing a woman running a small freight route out of a town that had already decided not to look at her too closely could do. She had hidden the ledger somewhere no one who wanted it would think to search, and she had kept driving her wagon on schedule, kept her face arranged into the flat patience of ordinary grief, and convinced herself that if she gave the syndicate no reason to suspect she knew anything. Beneath their notice, she had been wrong about that in exactly the way that gets people killed. Silas Cordell had built the largest cattle operation in 3 counties out of exactly the kind of patience Elias's ledger described, and patience, in a man like that, was not a virtue so much as a method. He did not panic when his landman reported that the assistant recorder had died asking questions he shouldn't have been asking. He simply waited, the way he waited on every deal, to see whether the questions had died with the man who asked them. He had his people watch the Hale house through the spring planting and into the dry heat of summer, watch the widow keep to her freight schedule and her small circle of neighbors and give no sign of knowing anything at all. And, for a while, then, 3 weeks before that morning on the trail, one of Cordell's own hired hands, a nervous drinking man named Purdy, who had helped move cattle off a homestead the syndicate had acquired the year before, had gotten drunk in the Larkspur Crossing saloon and let slip loud enough for the wrong ears. That the recorder's widow had been asking the county clerk pointed questions about a filing date that didn't match Cordell's paperwork. It had reached Silas Cordell inside a day. And Silas Cordell, who had survived 3 cattle wars and 1 hard winter that had killed half the herds in the territory, did not believe in loose threads that got to keep breathing. He had sent 3 men, not to kill her outright. A dead widow raised more questions than a living one, who simply vanished from the county's memory. But to find the ledger, wherever she'd hidden it. Rourke, a broad, sun-cracked man who had ridden for Cordell longer than almost anyone and had the flat, unbothered manner of someone who had stopped counting the things he'd done for money, led the 2 others, a younger man named Ness who talked too much, and a silent one everyone called Cutter for reasons nobody explained. Out along the freight road that morning to the one stretch of Widow's Grade, where a wagon could be forced off the trail without a witness for 5 miles in either direction. They had chosen well by their own accounting. They could not have known that the same stretch of the grade had been under a stranger's watch for 3 days running, because that stranger had learned, over years of doing exactly this kind of work, that the syndicate liked this road for its silence, and had simply waited on the high ground above it for them to make the mistake of proving him right. His name was Amos Calder, though almost nobody in 3 counties would have recognized it, and fewer still would have connected it to the quiet, sunburned drifter who had drawn no particular attention riding into Larkspur Crossing 11 days before. He kept a room above the livery, paid in advance and in cash, spoke to almost no one beyond what was needed to buy feed for his horse and coffee for himself, and gave every appearance of a man passing through on his way to somewhere else. It was a good disguise, because it required almost nothing false in it. Amos was, in fact, passing through, in the sense that he had been passing through one territory after another for the better part of 6 years, always circling closer to the same handful of names, always arriving in some quiet town a few weeks before something happened. He had not started as a hunter. He had started, 7 years before, as a younger brother, the kind who worked his older brother's homestead without complaint, and figured in the unhurried way of a man in his early 20s who has never had cause to think otherwise, that he had all the time in the world to build something of his own beside it. His brother Nathaniel had filed a claim on good bottomland along a creek that it turned out a rising cattle combine badly wanted for a shipping route. And when Nathaniel had refused 3 increasingly ugly offers to sell, the combine's men had burned him out in the night and left him for dead in the ashes of what he'd built. He had lived 4 days before the fever took him, long enough to tell Amos in pieces, who had ridden up to the house before the fire, and long enough for Amos to understand that no sheriff within riding distance was going to do anything about a range fire that had somehow started at 4 separate corners of a homestead at once. That combine had been a smaller operation, then one of the syndicate's earliest acquisitions on its slow climb toward becoming the largest cattle outfit in the territory, and the men who had ridden up to Nathaniel's house that night had scattered afterward into other jobs. The way men who do that kind of work tend to scatter once the job is finished and paid for. Amos had spent the first year after his brother's death simply grieving, and the 4 after that learning, with a grim and patient thoroughness that surprised even himself, exactly how to find men who did not want to be found. He was not a lawman. He had tried that route once, briefly, wearing a deputy's badge in a county 200 miles from here, and had learned that a badge bought you the appearance of authority and almost none of its substance when the men you were investigating owned the judge. He had put the badge down and picked up something more honest about what he actually was. A man keeping his own ledger, the same as Elias Hale had kept his, except that Amos's accounting settled in a different currency, and he had been working his way, patiently, methodically, up through the ranks of that old combine, now grown into Cordell Syndicate. For 6 years, closing accounts, one name at a time. He had heard Elias Hale's name 8 months before he ever set foot in Larkspur Crossing, in a saloon in a town 2 counties over, from a man who was, by that point, 3 drinks past careful and had mentioned, in the boastful way of men trying to impress a stranger who bought the next round, that the syndicate had handled a nosy recorder out near Larkspur without so much as a ripple. Amos had bought 2 more rounds and learned everything the man knew, which wasn't much beyond the recorder's name, and the fact that the widow had, so far, kept quiet. He had filed the information away with all the others he'd collected over the years, and continued his slow climb toward the men who mattered more. Rourke, who had a reputation for doing the syndicate's uglier work, and above him, eventually. It was pure method, not sentiment, that had finally brought him to Larkspur Crossing 11 days ago. He had simply worked his way down the chain of names until this town was next. And then he had spent his first 3 days in town doing what he always did before he moved on anyone. Watching, asking careful questions of people who didn't know they were being asked anything, learning the shape of the place. And it was in that watching that he had first seen Delphine Hale drive her freight wagon through the square. Upright and composed and entirely unaware that she was being studied by a stranger who recognized in the particular careful blankness of her face the exact look of someone keeping a secret too heavy to set down. He had not planned to involve himself in her situation beyond confirming what he already suspected, that she likely knew, or had, something the syndicate wanted badly enough to have killed her husband over. He had promised himself, the way he always did at the start of a job, that he would watch and gather what he needed, and move only when moving served the larger accounting. He had not planned on liking the steadiness in her, the way she held herself through a town that had quietly decided to look past her without ever quite looking away. Plans, in his experience, rarely survived first contact with a person worth protecting. If you are new here, this channel tells stories like Delphine's every week. Women the frontier tried to grind down, and the men who arrived, usually too quietly to be noticed at first, to make sure it didn't finish the job. Stay through to the end, because what happens on that ridge changes everything you think you know about who came to that trail, hunting whom. Now settle in, because it is time to go back to that morning on Widow's Grade, to the ditch and the pistol, and the three men who believed they had finally cornered a problem that had been solved for months. That was in the end the mistake that mattered most, not the ambush itself, which was competently done. The wagon forced off the grade, with a rope stretched low across the road at a blind curve, the wheels splitting on impact exactly as intended, Delphine thrown hard against the seat rail but not badly hurt. Dazed enough that she had barely gathered herself, before Rourke's pistol was already pointed at her chest, and Ness had her horse's bridle in hand so it couldn't bolt. It was efficient. It was the kind of thing these three men had done before more than once, and their confidence showed in the loose, unhurried way Rourke swung down from his saddle and walked toward the wagon like a man collecting on a debt rather than committing a crime. You've had 10 weeks to hand it over quiet. He was close enough now that she could smell the leather and horse sweat off him, his pistol never lowering. Your husband should have warned you that some questions get a person killed twice as fast as answering them wrong. Delphine did not answer right away. She had spent 10 weeks rehearsing, in the private hours when sleep wouldn't come, exactly this conversation, though she had never truly believed she would need the rehearsal, and now that the moment had arrived, she found the fear was not the paralyzing kind she'd imagined, but something colder. A fear that made her count things instead of freezing. 3 men, 1 pistol drawn, 2 horses within reach, the tree line 40 yards up the slope where the grade curved. I don't have it here. It was true, though not in the way she let him believe it. It's not something I'd carry on a supply run. Ness, the younger one, laughed at that in a way that had no humor in it, and Cutter stayed silent, only watching her the way a man watches a fire he expects to have to put out eventually. Rourke crouched slightly so his face was level with hers, where she sat frozen against the wagon seat, close enough that she could see the small scar through one eyebrow. The particular flatness of eyes that had done this kind of work often enough to have stopped finding it difficult. Then you're going to take a ride with us, and you're going to think real hard on the way about where a smart woman would have hidden her dead husband's mistake, because Mr. Sactor, Cordell, would a whole lot rather have a conversation with you than a funeral, but he'll take whichever one gets him his paper back. It was, Delphine understood, with a clarity that felt almost separate from the fear the first time anyone had spoken the word Cordell aloud to her in connection with Elias's death, and some small, stubborn part of her felt something almost like relief at finally hearing the truth spoken plainly, even with a gun in her face. It might have ended very badly, right there on the grade, with Delphine bundled onto a horse and carried off toward whatever quiet reckoning Silas Cordell had in mind if Rourke had been a more careful man, or if he had thought, even once, to post a man on the high ground above the curve. He had not, because in 11 months of doing this kind of work for the syndicate, nobody had ever interrupted him, and men who are never interrupted stop expecting to be. The first sign anything was wrong was Cutter's horse, tied loose at the tree line, throwing its head up and stamping at a sound none of the 3 men had caught yet. The second sign was the voice that came down off the slope above them, unhurried, almost conversational, the kind of voice that made Rourke's hand tighten on his pistol before his mind had finished deciding there was a reason to. 3 against 1 woman with a broken wheel, the voice went on, unhurried. Cordell's really scraping the bottom of his payroll these days. Amos Calder came down off the ridge at an angle that put the afternoon sun at his back and in their eyes, unhurried in a way that unnerved Rourke more than a charge would have, his rifle held loose but ready across his body, his hat brim low enough that his face stayed shadowed until he wanted it seen. He had been on that slope since before dawn, watching the grade the way he'd watched a dozen other stretches of road in a dozen other counties, and when the rope had gone taut across the trail and the wagon wheel had cracked, he had not moved right away. He had waited, the way he always waited, to be certain exactly what he was dealing with before he committed to it. And only when he'd seen the pistol come up level with Delphine's chest had he started down. "This isn't your business, stranger." Rourke's pistol had already shifted, uncertain now whether to stay on the widow or swing toward the new threat, and that half-second of hesitation was, in its own small way, right on. "Funny thing about that," Amos said, close enough now to be fully seen, his eyes doing the quiet arithmetic he always did on a man like Rourke, the set of his shoulders, the particular scar through his brow that matched a description Amos had carried in his memory for the better part of a year. Ever since a talkative drunk 2 counties back had described the man Cordell trusted with his uglier errands. "I've been making it my business for about 6 years now. You're Rourke. You rode for the outfit that burned a man named Nathaniel Calder off his creek claim north of the Sweetwater in '74, and I expect you don't even remember his name, because that's usually how it goes with men like you. I remember yours fine, though. Been carrying it a while. It was for Delphine, the first crack in the terror, not relief exactly, not yet, but the sudden dizzying understanding that the man on the ridge had not arrived by chance, that whatever was happening here was older. Rourke's face had gone carefully blank in the particular way of a man recalculating the odds of a fight he had walked into believing was already won. That was a long time back. His voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Whatever you think you're owed, it's got nothing to do with her. It's got everything to do with her, seeing as you're standing here fixing to do to her husband's memory exactly what your outfit did to my brothers. I've had 6 years to think about how I'd feel running into one of you again with a gun already out. Turns out I feel pretty settled about it. What happened next happened fast enough that Delphine, retelling it to herself for months afterward, could never fully separate the order of it, Ness going for his own pistol on some instinct that had nothing to do with courage. Amos's rifle coming up and firing in the same motion that seemed to cost him no visible effort at all, the shot taking Ness high in the shoulder and spinning him off his feet before his own pistol had cleared its holster, and Cutter, the silent one, breaking for his horse rather than for a fight the moment the first shot rang out. Because, whatever else Cutter was, he was not a man who stayed for odds he didn't like. Rourke alone held his ground, his pistol swinging fully toward Amos now, and in the half-second before he could fire, Amos's second shot took the pistol clean out of his hand in a spray of blood and metal that left Rourke on his knees in the road. Cradling a shattered hand and staring up at the stranger with the first real fear Delphine had seen on any of their faces since the ambush began. "You're going to want to remember something." Amos stepped close enough now that his shadow fell across the kneeling man. "And you're going to want to remember it exact because I'm only saying it once. Go back to Cordell, and you tell him the widow's ledger isn't the only accounting that's been kept on his outfit these 6 years. Tell him the man who's been closing his books, one rider at a time, just found Larkspur Crossing, and tell him I'll be seeing him directly. He did not kill Rourke, though Delphine would understand only much later how deliberate that restraint had been, how much it had cost a man who had every reason in the world to end it there in the road. A dead Rourke could carry Cordell nothing. A living one, terrified and humiliated and bearing a message, would do far more damage to the syndicate's confidence than a body in a ditch ever could. Cutter did not stop riding until he was well past the county line, and Ness, bleeding and half-conscious, was left where he lay until Rourke, moving slow and gray-faced with his ruined hand, managed to drag him up onto a horse and start the long ride back toward Cordell's ranch. Dot carrying with him a message that would reach Silas Cordell within the hour and would not improve his mood in the slightest. Amos turned to Delphine only once the road was empty, and found her still sitting in the wrecked wagon, upright with a straight-back composure that he would come to recognize over the following days as entirely characteristic of her, not the absence of fear but the refusal to let it run the show. "You're not hurt." It wasn't quite a question, more a thing he needed confirmed aloud before his own pulse would slow. "Bruised. Frightened half out of my skin, if I'm honest, which I don't imagine I have much reason not to be with you at this point." She studied him for a long moment, taking in the details a woman in her position had every right to take in. The worn rifle, the careful stillness of a man used to violence but not comfortable in it, the eyes that had gone soft with concern the instant the threat was handled. "You knew those men. You knew Rourke's name before he gave it." "I've known it a while," Amos said, and something in his voice made clear that the conversation ahead of them was going to be longer and heavier than either of them had planned on having that afternoon. They did not have that conversation on the road. Amos got her horse calmed, and the wagon's broken wheel lashed well enough to limp the 4 miles back into Larkspur Crossing, and he rode alongside her the whole way, mostly silent, watching the tree line with the particular alertness of a man who understood that Cordell's response to this morning's failure would not be slow in coming. It was only that evening in the back room of the small freight office Delphine ran out of a converted barn behind her house, a room she trusted because it had no windows facing the road and only one door, that they finally sat across from each other with the whole ugly shape of the situation laid out between them. She walked him through the ledger, the strongbox and the oilcloth, the 10 weeks of pretending she knew nothing while carrying every single day, the specific weight of knowing everything. She described the coroner's report that didn't fit the man she'd married, about Sheriff Dunmore's cozy arrangement with Cordell's land agent, about the 4 homesteads Elias's careful handwriting had traced from honest claim to forged transfer to syndicate deed within the space of a few pages. Amos listened without interrupting, in the particular quiet way of a man who had learned, over years of collecting other people's grief, that the kindest thing he could do was simply let a person finish. When she was done, he gave her, in turn, the account of Nathaniel, the creek claim, the four-cornered fire, and the 4 days his brother had taken to die, telling him who to remember, and more briefly, the 6 years since, the towns, the names, the slow patient climbing of a ladder whose top rung was Silas Cordell himself, a man Amos had never yet stood in front of, though he had been walking toward that meeting for longer than Delphine had been married. "I didn't come to Larkspur Crossing for you." His tone stayed plain, because he did not seem to be a man who softened hard truths for comfort's sake. "I came because your husband's name reached me 8 months back, and I work my way down a list. But I'm not leaving you to face what's coming just because you weren't the reason I arrived." Before we go further into what Cordell decided to do about the message Rourke carried back to him, and it was not a gentle decision, I want to ask something small of you if this story has you the way it's had a lot of people this week. If you keep coming back for these frontier stories, become a channel member. Just tap the join button beside the channel name to support the show directly. It costs little. Silas Cordell had built an empire on the principle that fear, applied early and applied precisely, was cheaper than any lawsuit or any bullet spent later. When Rourke rode in that evening, gray with blood loss and humiliation, and delivered Amos's message word for word the way he'd been instructed to, Cordell did not rage the way a lesser man might have. He listened, seated behind the wide oak desk in the ranch house he built to look older and more established than it actually was. And when Rourke finished, he asked only one question. Did he give a name? Rourke shook his head, still cradling the ruined hand a doctor in town had done what he could with, though it would never close a fist properly again. Only claimed he's been keeping his own accounting, said he'd be seeing you directly. Cordell was quiet for a long while after that, turning the information over the way he turned over every problem, looking for the angle that would let him solve it the way he solved everything, with patience, with money, or, failing both, with overwhelming and immediate force. He did not, in the end, believe the stranger's claim of some long private vendetta. Men like Cordell rarely credited the idea that anyone acted from anything other than the same appetites that drove him: money, land, leverage, and so he settled quickly on the explanation that made the most sense to him, which was that the widow had finally hired protection, and that the stranger was simply a gun for hire whose price hadn't yet been discovered. It was a comforting mistake, and it would cost him more than he understood, because a man who believes his enemy can be bought will always misjudge the one time his enemy cannot be. His response, characteristically, was not subtle. He could not afford subtlety now, not with a widow who clearly knew more than she'd let on, an armed stranger openly threatening him, and the ugly possibility that whatever paper Elias Hale had assembled before his death, he needed the ledger found and destroyed, the widow silenced one way or another, and the stranger removed as a complication, and he needed all three accomplished quickly enough that no territorial marshal ever got curious about a quiet county where an unusual number of accidents kept happening to the wrong people. Over the following 4 days, the pressure on Delphine tightened in ways designed to be deniable and unbearable at once. Her freight contract with the general store, nearly a third of her income, was abruptly canceled, the owner apologetic and visibly frightened, unwilling to meet her eyes as he explained that he'd found another arrangement, though everyone in town, The bank, which held the note on her small property, sent a polite letter noting an unexpected acceleration clause that would call the full balance due within 30 days rather than the 3 years remaining on the original terms. Though proving it would require a lawyer she couldn't afford and a court that answered in practice to the same interests squeezing her now. Neighbors who had brought bread and quiet sympathy after Elias's funeral now crossed the street rather than be seen speaking with her, not out of unkindness, but out of the particular practical fear of people who had watched what happened to homesteaders who crossed the syndicate and had no illusions about their own power to withstand the same treatment. And on the third night, someone set fire to the small barn behind her house that served as her freight office, not the house itself, a distinction Delphine understood immediately as a message rather than an accident. Amos, who had taken to sleeping in the loft of her actual barn rather than his room above the livery, was up and outside within moments of the smoke reaching him, and between the two of them and a bucket line hastily formed by two neighbors brave enough to help despite the risk. Though the freight office and the modest inventory inside it burned to nothing before the fire had run its course. Delphine stood in the dooryard afterward, soot-streaked and shaking with an anger that had finally, mercifully, burned through the numbness of the last 10 weeks, and informed Amos, in a voice gone hard and flat, that she was done being careful. "They killed my husband and dressed it up as an accident. They just tried to burn me out of my home, and I'm supposed to sit here and let them decide when it's my turn to disappear too. No, I want to finish what Elias started. I want that ledger in front of someone who can actually use it, and I want Cordell's name attached to every death he's paid for." Amos studied her for a long moment in the orange light of the dying embers, and what he felt in that moment, though he would not have named it so plainly, even to himself, was something closer to respect than to the protective instinct that had first pulled him down off that ridge. He had spent 6 years watching people break under exactly this kind of pressure, watched good men sell their land for pennies and move their families out of the territory rather than fight, watched widows and orphans accept whatever terms the syndicate offered rather than risk what he just watched Delphine risk. He had not expected, walking into Larkspur Crossing 11 days ago, to find someone who met that pressure with her spine straighter rather than bent. "Then we do it right," he told her, "which means we don't hand Cordell another chance to catch us unprepared. He knows now that I'm not for sale and that you're not backing down, which means the next move he makes won't be subtle, like a fire. It'll be a reckoning he thinks he can win outright." He was not wrong. 2 days later, word reached them through a nervous, stable hand who owed Amos a favor from an earlier kindness that Cordell had sent riders to 3 neighboring towns to bring in extra guns, not the careless hired hands like Rourke's crew, the kind who worked for cattle outfits, specifically for situations that required more force than intimidation alone could provide. Cordell, it seemed, intended to end this decisively. It was in the days that followed, while Cordell assembled his hired guns and Delphine and Amos worked out, in careful hushed planning sessions in the loft of her barn, exactly how they intended to survive what was coming, that Amos shared with her, more fully than he had that first night, the whole of what 6 years of hunting the syndicate's men had taught him. He explained that Cordell, for all his ruthlessness, was a man who valued his reputation among the territory's other cattle barons and financiers almost as much as his money. That public exposure frightened him in a way that a private gunfight never would, because a private gunfight could be explained away or buried, while a public reckoning, witnessed by enough of the right people, could not. He spent 15 years building himself into a respectable man, Amos said. Bank director, church elder, the fellow the territorial governor shakes hands with at the county fair. That respectability is worth more to him than any single ranch he's swallowed. If we can get your husband's ledger in front of witnesses he can't buy or intimidate the circuit judge, maybe, or a federal marshal, somebody outside his reach, in a setting public enough that he can't simply have us disappeared afterward, we end him. It was, Delphine understood, not merely a plan for survival, but the culmination of everything Amos had spent 6 years working toward. Not one more quiet killing added to whatever private accounting he kept, but the actual, achieved not through more violence, but through the one weapon Cordell had never learned to defend against the truth, delivered where he couldn't buy his way around it. They learned, through the same nervous stable hand, that Cordell had arranged to host the territory's traveling circuit judge for a dinner in Larkspur Crossing in 5 days' time. An annual courtesy Cordell extended to keep himself in the judge's good graces. That could not have been better designed for their purposes if they'd planned it themselves. A public dinner, attended by half the town's notable citizens, presided over by exactly the kind of outside authority Cordell couldn't simply pay off or intimidate into silence. If the ledger could be presented there in front of witnesses who couldn't later be pressured into forgetting what they'd seen, Cordell would have no room left to maneuver. The 5 days that followed were the hardest of Delphine's life, harder even than the 10 weeks of grief that had preceded them, because now the waiting had a deadline and every hour of it carried the knowledge that Cordell's hired guns were gathering. She retrieved the ledger from its hiding place, a hollowed section of a fence post on the edge of her property, chosen precisely because it looked like nothing worth searching, and copied its most damning pages twice more by hand, in case the original was lost or destroyed before it reached the judge. Hiding the copies separately with 2 people in town she trusted enough to risk asking. Amos spent the days scouting the dinner's location, a hall behind the town's largest hotel, mapping its entrances and exits with the same patient thoroughness he'd once applied to tracking down men who didn't want to be found. To a deputy federal marshal he'd worked with once years before, in the badge-wearing chapter of his life, he rarely spoke of, a man named Osgood who, as it happened, owed Amos a debt from a case that had gone very differently because of information, to be present in Larkspur Crossing on the night of the dinner, quietly, without announcing his purpose in advance. Cordell, for his part, spent those same 5 days convinced he had the advantage. His hired guns had arrived, 6 of them, hard professional men who set up watch around his ranch and around the edges of town without bothering to hide their presence. A deliberate show of force meant to remind Larkspur Crossing exactly whose territory this remained. He had heard nothing further from the stranger who'd humiliated Rourke on the trail, and, in the absence of further contact, he had allowed himself to believe the man had perhaps reconsidered the wisdom of standing against 6 professional guns and simply moved on, taking whatever fee he'd apparently been paid, and leaving the widow to face the consequences alone. It was again the mistake of a man who had spent so long being the most dangerous person in every room that he had lost the habit of imagining a room where that might not be true. On the evening of the dinner, Larkspur Crossing's largest hotel hall, filled with the particular nervous festivity of a town putting its best face on for an important visitor, the circuit judge, a stern, silver-haired man named Whitfield, who traveled the territory dispensing what passed for law in places too small and too remote. Seated at the head table beside Cordell himself, who had dressed for the occasion in a black coat that made him look, Delphine thought bitterly as she watched from the edge of the hall, in a dress she'd chosen specifically to let her move quickly if she needed to. Exactly like the respectable pillar of the community he'd spent 15 years constructing himself into. She had come, ostensibly as one more invited guest, her presence unremarkable among the town's shopkeepers and ranchers, though Cordell's eyes had found her the moment she entered and stayed on her, cold and assessing, for a long moment before he returned his attention to the judge with practiced smoothness. Amos was not in the hall at all. When the dinner began, a deliberate choice, since his face was now known to Cordell's men, and his presence would have triggered exactly the violent response they were trying to avoid until the moment of their own choosing. He waited instead outside near the hall's side entrance with Deputy Marshal Osgood beside him in plain clothes, watching the windows, counting the minutes until the dinner's formal courses gave way to the after-dinner conversation, would open the floor briefly to any citizen with a grievance the traveling court might address before moving on to the next town. It was in that window, the judge rising, glass in hand, inviting with courteous formality anyone present who wished to raise a matter of law or grievance before his court moved on in the morning, that Delphine stood. The hall went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone senses, before they understand why, that something is about to happen that will matter. Cordell's expression did not change, not yet, though something in his posture went very still. "Your Honor." Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect it to be, given how hard her heart was hammering against her ribs. "My name is Delphine Hale. My husband, Elias, served this county 6 years as assistant land recorder until his death this past summer, which the coroner ruled an accident on widow's grade. She had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it so many times in the loft of her barn, with Amos correcting her pacing and reminding her gently that the facts alone would carry more weight than any anger she layered over them, that the words came now with a clarity that surprised even her. "I do not believe it was an accident. I believe my husband discovered that the Cordell Cattle Syndicate had, over a period of years, forged land claims, seized water rights through fraud, and was responsible for the deaths of at least 4 homesteaders whose land was subsequently absorbed into the syndicate's holdings. I believe he was killed to keep him from reporting what he'd found, and I have his written record of it here, in his own hand, kept in detail across 11 months, which I would ask this court to examine." The reaction in the hall was immediate and total, a wave of gasps and low murmurs, chairs scraping as people turned to look at Cordell, whose face had, for the first time in longer than most of them had known him, lost its careful composure entirely. He rose, his voice sharp with an anger he was struggling visibly to keep at the register of outraged respectability rather than raw fury. "This is slander, the ravings of a grieving widow, who's clearly been manipulated by whatever drifter she's taken up with since her husband's death, Your Honor. I'd remind the court that—" "That drifter," said a voice from the hall's side entrance, and every head turned as Amos stepped through it. Deputy Marshal Osgood a half step behind him, badge now visible on his coat where it had been hidden all evening. "Cordell, starting with my brother Nathaniel Calder, whose homestead your combine burned in the year 74 when it went by a different name and you were a younger, hungrier man with the same appetite for other people's land." The hall had gone utterly silent, now every eye moving between Cordell, pale and rigid at the head table, and Amos, walking forward with unhurried deliberateness, his coat pushed back just enough that the pistol at his hip was visible without being drawn. I've spent those 6 years closing accounts on the men who did your dirty work, one at a time, and I could have closed yours the same private way, Cordell. And there've been nights I wanted to. You built your whole life on being untouchable, on being the man nobody in this territory could afford to cross. I wanted you to lose that in front of every person who ever shook your hand and called you respectable. Judge Whitfield, who had sat through the exchange with the sharp, assessing stillness of a man used to reading a courtroom for truth beneath performance, raised a hand for quiet and turned to Delphine. You mentioned a written record, Mrs. Hale. I'll see it now. In front of this room, if you please. Delphine crossed the hall with the ledger already in hand. She had carried it wrapped in cloth beneath her shawl the entire evening, unwilling to let it out of arm's reach for even a moment, and set it before the judge, opening it to the pages she and Amos had marked, dates and names laid out in Elias's careful, methodical handwriting. Tracing the exact pattern of forged claims and vanished homesteaders that Cordell had spent years believing no one would ever be positioned to assemble. Cordell made one final desperate move, his hand dropping toward the pistol he wore even to a formal dinner, a habit of a man who had never fully trusted the respectability he'd built. But Deputy Marshal Osgood had anticipated exactly this. And the sight of a federal marshal's badge and steady aim was enough, even for a man of Cordell's pride, to make the calculation that dying in a hotel dining hall in front of the circuit judge was a worse outcome than surrender. His hand came away from the pistol slowly, and something in his face, the last of the careful mask he'd worn for 15 years, finally, visibly, broke. The reckoning that followed was, in its way, less dramatic than the ambush on the trail had been, and far more thorough in its consequences. Judge Whitfield, working with Deputy Marshal Osgood over the following days, cross-referenced Elias's ledger against county records that Cordell's people had not yet had opportunity to alter, and conspiracy in at least 2 of the 4 deaths the ledger documented, charges that would over the following months unravel the syndicate's carefully built empire piece by piece as other victims, emboldened by the first crack in Cordell's untouchability, came forward with their own accounts of stolen land. Sheriff Dunmore, whose quiet arrangement with Cordell's land agent came out in the same proceedings, was removed from his post within the week, replaced by a man the town actually trusted. Rourke, still nursing his ruined hand, was arrested, attempting to flee the territory, and faced with the weight of evidence and the prospect of hanging for his part in Elias Hale's death, gave a full account of the murder in exchange for a lesser sentence, an account that closed, at last, the one piece of the record Elias's ledger alone couldn't prove. If this story has held you this long, become a channel member so these tales keep coming every week. Tap Join beside the channel name. It only takes a moment, and it truly helps. In the weeks that followed Cordell's arrest, Larkspur Crossing began, slowly and imperfectly, to remember how to be a town that wasn't afraid of its own shadow. The families who'd sold land under duress began quiet conversations with lawyers about reclaiming what had been taken from them. The general store owner who'd canceled Delphine's freight contract came to her door personally to apologize and to ask, sheepishly, whether she'd consider taking the business back, an offer she accepted with more grace than the man probably deserved, because Delphine had never been a woman inclined to hold a grudge against someone who'd simply been as frightened as everyone else. The bank's acceleration clause was quietly, permanently forgotten once the man who'd pressured the bank into inserting it no longer had any leverage to enforce anything at all. Delphine rebuilt her burned freight office over that autumn, with help from neighbors who now came forward openly rather than crossing the street, and she kept the business running under her own name, on her own terms, a small, stubborn monument to a husband who had died protecting the truth. She had his name added, formally, to the county recorder's memorial that fall, not as a footnote to an accident, but as a public servant who had uncovered corruption at considerable personal cost. Amos stayed in Larkspur Crossing longer than his usual habit allowed for, though he would have sworn, in the early days after Cordell's arrest, that he was only staying to see the federal case through to its conclusion to testify when Osgood needed him. To make certain the accounting was properly closed before he moved on to whatever came next on his long list of names. It became harder, as the weeks passed, to pretend that was the whole of it. He found himself lingering at Delphine's rebuilt freight office on evenings when there was no remaining reason to, helping repair the roof of her barn, though the work no longer required his particular skills, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table long after the practical matters of the case had been settled, in the unhurried way of two people who had discovered, somewhere in the middle of surviving something together that they had rather a lot they still wanted to say to each other. She wondered aloud once in the quiet of one of those evenings what he intended to do now that the account he'd carried for 6 years against Cordell's outfit had finally fully closed. He was honest with her in the plain way that had become one of the things she trusted most about him. "I don't rightly know," he admitted. "I've spent so long working toward this one ending. There are other names on my list, other men from that outfit who scattered before I ever reached this county, and I expect I'll finish that work eventually, because I made myself a promise a long time ago. But I find I'm in less of a hurry to ride out than I was 11 days before I met you." It was not, either of them understood, quite a declaration, not yet, but it was an honest accounting of where he stood, and Delphine found she wanted more than she had let herself want anything since Elias's death. She kept the ranch, she kept her husband's name, and her husband's memory, restored now to what it should always have been, rather than the quiet convenient lie the coroner had first offered her. And on the evenings when Amos Calder's horse was tied outside her rebuilt barn rather than saddled for the next county, Delphine allowed herself, for the first time in a long year of grief and fear and finally hard-won justice, to imagine. Widow's Grade still carries its name today, a small local reminder of the morning a widow's wagon was run off the trail by men who believed they had finally silenced a dead man's inconvenient truth, and found instead, waiting on the ridge above them, a reckoning that had been coming for 6 patient years. If this story moved you the way it moved everyone in the comments this week, tell us where you're watching from, and if you want more of these frontier justice stories, delivered every week, subscribing costs nothing.